Welcome back to another episode of Divorce at Altitude podcast. I am Ryan Calamea, one of your co-hosts. This week, I am joined by a Chicago divorce lawyer, Raiford Palmer. He's recently come out with a book. We're going to talk about that book. But first of all, Raif, how are things in Chicago?
Going well, having a nice summer. Thank you very much. The book launch has made very busy, but things are great. Thank you.
Indeed. Well, we're going to talk about the 5 key points of the book, but I wanted to ask a couple, preliminary questions, and that is, how did you get into doing divorce law? I know in your foreword, I was interested to kind of read your story, but for listeners to give a preview, how'd you get into being a divorce lawyer?
Sure, it was really by happenstance. Basically, a personal injury client I had asked me for a referral to a divorce attorney. I gave her a guy's name that was in my Rolodex back when we had Rolodexes. That's how old I am. And she called the person. I guess I got a call about a week or two later, and she said, I didn't like the guy. He was a real jerk. And I'd never heard any negative feedback about this person at all. I'd sent a bunch of clients to this gentleman over a long period of time. So I was shocked, but she said, why can't you handle my divorce? Because I really didn't have anybody else to send her to in the area. So at the time I said, well, I don't do divorce. I do personal injury. I do business litigation and other things. And she said, well, it can't be that hard. We just have a house and 2 cars and we both work and 2 kids and we're not fighting. So she said, why can't you do it? I like you. You're a nice guy. Why can't you handle my case? And I thought about it. And at the time we were kind of doing everything that came in the door. We had a small law firm, it was just me and a partner. It's 2001. And I talked to him over lunch and he said, sure, why don't, if you're upfront with her about it, why don't you try it? Can't be that hard. He said, famous last words. Right. And I literally bought the books. Like I bought books on Illinois divorce law and started reading. And I told her, I was upfront. I said, I know civil litigation, I understand trial practice, but I've never done a divorce case. So I learned by reading, plus luckily there was a couple lawyers across the hall from us in our office. One of them's now a judge. Her name's Pam Loza. She's in Cook County, Chicago. And she was kind enough to give some advice when I needed sort of strategic guidance early on. And a gentleman named Tom Cameron also was working with her. So we kind of had a exchange of information. I would talk to them about civil litigation. Sometimes they would talk about divorce when I got started. And it just took off from there. She was happy about the results. She sent friends and they sent friends. And all of a sudden I was a divorce attorney and doing these other things. So that's how it started.
Well, I thought it was interesting. You were kind enough to send me an advanced copy of the book. That your observation is that most divorce lawyers are not very good trial lawyers because they don't have that experience. And it's that was an interesting observation. I was a prosecutor, and you make a point of saying that divorces, they're almost all bench trials except for Texas, and judges are usually very forgiving on the rules of evidence. So it's not necessarily the best training ground for trial lawyers, and then the judges kind of give them a pass. So
Right.
I thought that was an interesting observation.
Thank you. And what I'm getting at there is it's not meant to knock all of our fellow divorce lawyers. The idea is to have the potential client, the person reading the book, understand the world that they're operating in and understand the weather conditions that are affecting their case and their universe when they're going through a divorce case. And there are a lot of things that flow from divorce lawyers, many of them not understanding how trials work. One of them is not really advising the clients at an early stage what a trial will involve, how much discovery will be involved, depositions, that the true expense of a trial, is not really being fully explained to people. The other thing is the imperfections of a trial, as you well know. It's a sausage factory and it doesn't always come out the way one wants it to. And I think clients from TV and movies think, well, justice prevails. And when we put all the information in the hopper, in the computer program of the divorce court, the answer will come out in a nice and neat way. And you certainly know from your experience, it's never quite that way. It never comes out quite the way you hope it will, or that's rare. And people are usually almost always better off settling a case if they can negotiate a settlement. They can control the terms and have a controlled landing rather than something that includes a lot more randomness from a judge who doesn't know them very well.
Yeah, 100%. And the judge may not care, as I mean, they certainly don't care about the outcome as much as the people involved. And one thing
Right.
you get into with your book is the competing interests with divorce lawyers, with other people that are involved. And we'll jump quickly into the number one topic or number one key, and that is that smart people get sucked into the swamp of litigation all too often. But I think you are absolutely right. I think sometimes it's they say ignorance is bliss, and sometimes divorce lawyers who are not familiar with the like the risks that are attendant with trial. I mean, you can have a witness that you prep so much that just completely uh, goes blink eyed, a
Right.
deer in the headlights. And
Yes.
that is such a significant risk. And then you also have I mean, people, they want to win their divorce. And we'll talk about that. But it's just, you don't get you can't handle the truth, Tom Cruise,
Right.
moment. And people, and you do such a great job of painting the scene in your first chapter about Chris, your ideal, or a typical divorce client.
Sure.
And what Chris, there's moment where, Chris finds out that his wife is cheating on him, and he may want that, you can't handle the truth moment.
Right.
But why is that? Why Chris is a divorce lawyer, or not divorce, he's a divorce client. But can you tell the listeners why Chris, is a business owner, he's a smart person. Why can he get sucked into the swamp of litigation, all too frequently?
Sure. So because he's never been in a divorce before. So I mean that's number one. So even though we have very smart, very successful clients who are tremendously successful in their fields, they may own a large business, they may own part of a business, or they're a successful physician or something like that, and they're um, experts in their field. They've never been divorced before. It would be just like me trying to get into brain surgery. I've never been a doctor. I've never been a physician. I don't know anything about surgery, and I wouldn't attempt to do that. But in this case, somebody's forcing a divorce, which is the intersection of everything people hold dear: love, sex, money, children, all crashes together. And at the end of a marriage, people are upset, they're emotional, and emotions take over a person who otherwise is a fully rational, very intelligent person. And they're mad, understandably, or sad, or whatever. They're feeling very emotional, and emotions can take hold and thwart somebody who otherwise makes very rational, calculated business decisions. In this case, the person starts making very illogical decisions that are governed by emotion and anger or fear, any number of emotions, and sometimes not tempered by an advice from an attorney. Sometimes. So it's it can be a dangerous place for a business person to be who has high net worth, high income. They are comfortable operating in their arena, and they think that the things that apply in their world apply in the divorce world. And I'm probably pretty sure you know that it's just different. It's just not that way. And things that frustrate people that normally these clients are type A control people who are comfortable controlling their environment and have worked very hard in their lives to control the variables. And all of a sudden they're thrust in a universe where they control very few variables. And that's very, very upsetting to them.
Yeah, we have. I mean, our firm does criminal defense, personal injury, and family law, and there's a saying, it's not our firm saying, but there's a saying that in criminal law that you get to see bad people at their best because they've gotten caught and they want to put on their best version of themselves so that they mitigate the consequences. It's
Sure.
only natural. But then in family law, you see good people at their worst.
Right.
You yourself went through a divorce. Can you tell our listeners? I mean, lawyers, we are type A, generally speaking, personalities, and that is one of the reasons that you identify that people can get involved in litigation. So how did you avoid that? And can you tell us a little bit about the background that you share in the book?
Yeah, it's obviously not fun to talk about, but I was divorced in 2015, and before that, I thought I was kind of immune to it. I thought my wife and I, both my ex-wife and my parents are still married, which is amazing, and it's congratulations to both of them, and they've had good marriages. And my parents really never fought in front of us. I never saw much conflict. They kind of kept that under wraps. I have one sister, and she and I never saw really anything other than a pretty happy marriage. We had what I would consider to be an ideal childhood. We were really blessed with great parents and a great upbringing. We were very lucky in that regard. So I just kind of expected when I got married, I'd just have the same thing because, well, of course, I'm a nice guy. My wife's a nice woman. My ex-wife. We're both smart people. We're both very accomplished. We both went and got advanced degrees. She was a teacher and later a school administrator, had a master's and almost a doctorate. And we had everything. We had a nice house. We had a second house. We had cars. We had two, beautiful sons. They're doing great now. They're now 20 and 24. And we sort of had it all, and at some point we lost each other in the shuffle of buying houses, fixing up houses, building our careers, children, all that stuff. At some point we became disconnected, and eventually we decided to get divorced. Your question originally was, how do we avoid litigation? I would say because I knew better.
Well, you were a divorce lawyer at that point, which can go either way. And you presented in the beginning of your book, there's a fork in the road, and you were presented with a fork in the road. So how did you take the less bumpy road?
So to give my ex-wife full credit, she's a very practical person, super intelligent and very successful. And she didn't want any trouble. She knew from listening to me and other lawyers that we knew that people got sucked into litigation all the time at no ultimate benefit to their families. And she was a very practical person and also knew about the finances. So we opened up we had a lot of counseling, things like that, but we opened up our laptops, sat down together and kind of went through the finances together. And it was a very rational discussion, which is in my nature and in her nature. We're not, we're both practical people. And so to some extent it was our personalities that paid off, but a lot of it also was the horror stories that I would come back and I'd talk about a case here and there where good people were sucked into, went down a drain of expensive litigation, and neither of us could afford that. Our children couldn't emotionally afford that. We didn't want to afford that. We wanted to move on with our lives as efficiently as possible. So we chose the collaborative route. And I'd already been involved in collaborative for 7 years or so by that point.
And how did it go telling your boys?
It was awful. It was the worst, still the worst day of my life was telling our sons. And we did everything the counselors tell you to do, which is, and we have a great, phenomenal counselor helped us out. She's well known in our community, just parenting, coaching, and counseling. And she gave us great guidance in what to say and what not to say. And it essentially is be on the same page, let the kids know what's going to happen, immediately, because kids want to know what's going to happen to them because children are selfish by nature and they're scared and they want to know everything's going to be all right. And they want to know that, as far as it can be, they want to know where they're going to live and what it's going to be like. So, and they don't need to know the whys and wherefores. That's adult stuff between the parents. So you have to get on the same page, have a unified message, and deliver that unified message to your kids. There is no good way to do it. It's awful. It's absolutely awful.
But it sounds like you were unified in knowing what your goals were and your concerns, which leads us to the second point,
Yep.
um, is that you have to know your goals and concerns and being realistic about what's achievable. So how do you reconcile that point with, that you can't force the other party? I mean, there's a reason you're going through a divorce.
Right.
So are you trying to focus on the client's goal and concerns when, I mean, how do you reconcile that if the other party's not willing to share those goals and concerns, which you and your ex-wife shared at the time and you were fortunate? So what happens when there's a difference in goals and concerns between the parties going through a divorce?
So that's a big problem. So you're absolutely right. If the parties are able to communicate, then we were able to get on the same page about communicating to the children and other things before we had to deliver that message. Now it can go sideways where one person out of spite or whatever goes and talks to the kids by themselves and badmouths the other parent and kicks it off in the worst way possible, where the kids are scared, they're confused, they're only hearing from one person. Maybe that person is badmouthing the other parent and maybe making up stuff or worse. And then it starts, that's the kind of thing that drives people into what I call the swamp of litigation. The other person gets angry and they want revenge, they feel hurt, and they want to do something back. But to get people on track to know their goals and concerns, that's a standard part of mediation, as you know, in collaborative law is spending the first meeting, getting everybody on the same page, going through goals and concerns. In litigation, it's more challenging because you might not get that open communication. You might have to resort to the lawyers talking to the other lawyer to find out what the goals are of the other person, but they might not tell you all their goals and concerns. They might think it's a strategic advantage to conceal some of that. So one thing I describe to clients is, if you're in a typical litigation scenario, one of the problems is it's like two contractors building one house. One's building from the front, one's building from the back with two slightly different sets of plans, and they might meet in the middle. The floor might be level or it might be off by 6 feet, you know, and that can be a horrible problem. You're trying to bend that so that it works. And you're right. Sometimes these goals don't become evident till it's the eve of trial and you're trying to negotiate a settlement.
Right, and your third point is to hire a qualified, lawyer who's skilled in negotiation but can also litigate. So to kind of use your metaphor, to recognize kind of like from an architectural standpoint, hey, this house, um, we want to get you divorced. So how do you get to that outcome? How do you get that when the other side could be building, something, a goal that is, they're just doing their own thing. So what points or tips do you have for people in selecting a lawyer and the difference between negotiation and litigation?
So really, that's really kind of a two-part thing. So starting with part one, how to choose a lawyer. There are lawyers, by the way, who just do negotiating and don't do any litigation, and they can be excellent too. It all depends on the people involved and the tenor of the relationship. So there are couples that are perfectly suited to go to collaborative lawyers who never try a case, maybe have never tried a case, obviously. But then there are folks that really are better suited to go to a lawyer who can do litigation or negotiation or a combination of the two. So the first thing is understanding who you are and who your spouse is a little bit, and getting a realistic appraisal of, is this going to be a fight or do I think this will ultimately settle by agreement? Where are we going? And a lot of that can be found out by getting some advice from a counselor, talking to some lawyers in consultations. I do recommend people talk to maybe a couple lawyers rather than just one to get some perspective. But the first thing is, I don't recommend that people work with what I call dabblers, or people that just do a little bit of family law and they really do all this other stuff. Your firm concentrates in three clear types of litigation that have some real similarities. That's one thing. But somebody who's a general practitioner who does everything that comes in the door, they're not going to be as up on divorce law as somebody who is more concentrated in it. So I try to recommend people work with someone who has substantial divorce law experience. It's okay to do more than one practice area, but they really need to be experienced in divorce and family law.
Yeah, so you wouldn't hire the Raif Palmer back when you first got in the divorce law.
I would not
Um,
have been my
and
choice. I would not have hired myself in 2001. I'd say, this guy doesn't do it, forget it. I'd move on to somebody else. Luckily, she took a chance on me back then. But yeah, then looking for hallmarks of experience, like in some states, they have a certification. We don't in Illinois, but some states have a certification for divorce law. So that requires extra testing and vetting. That's a plus. Some states require a certification for a lawyer to practice divorce. The other thing is membership in a divorce specific organization like the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers. I'm a fellow in that organization. Again, requires extra vetting from judges and other lawyers and a testing protocol. But then things like Google reviews. Look at what the clients have said about the person. Are they satisfied with the service they're getting? Is the lawyer responsive? Are they not returning calls? Those kinds of things are really important. And a personal referral is huge. Is your CPA recommending the lawyer? Is it a friend of yours that got divorced and worked with that attorney? Obviously, those are powerful too. And then your own intuition. Meet with the person. Do you feel like it's a good fit? Is the person listening to you? Do they understand what you're saying? Are they patient with you? Are they good at scheduling the consultation? If they're not real good at scheduling a meeting where you're maybe going to pay them a lot of money, maybe they're not going to do so well handling your divorce once you're already a client. I don't know. Maybe they're not going to be great about returning calls. These kinds of things are all hallmarks of quality service.
no, absolutely. For me, I think our firm, one thing that is a balance is we'll say, well, we think the judge is going to do this, or we know this judge. I mean, because we operate in specific counties, we know the judges,
Right.
it's harder down in the metropolitan area. I'm sure it's the same thing in Cook County, but that we'll mention we think that the judge is going to do this, and a client will say, well, if we get to trial, you have to explain to the client that everyone involved, in particular the lawyers, are going to have the negotiation standpoint of what would ultimately happen. And then they use
Yep.
that, and that's going to determine how they approach the negotiation. And that's point number one. Point number two is that, and I'm sure you guys deal with it in Chicago, is that there are definitely attorneys where they are unbelievably creative in coming up with solutions,
Yep.
and they may not be the best trial lawyers, but they are amazingly creative, and they know that they know what the law is and what you can obtain, but then they find solutions, and those are the great divorce lawyers. They can really try to find the win-win solutions.
Yes.
And that really is what I think people they don't understand when they're in a divorce, how that skill set can really matter.
Absolutely. So I talk about those two things. You make great points. The first thing is what I call the guardrails. Or the world of possibility. That when you're saying what's the judge going to do, so it's your knowledge of the law and the fact combined with the facts, combined with your knowledge of the particular court. If you have that level of experience, and you do, then you can intelligently tell your client, look, in a similar circumstance, here's what's likely to happen, or I saw this happen in a previous case, and I can tell you with some certainty, this is how your case will likely come out if this evidence comes out this way. Well, you're giving the client super valuable intelligence, and forecast they may not be able to get from another attorney. And you're telling them this is the realm of possibility from A to F or D or whatever it is. And then, okay, I always imagine a Venn diagram, and I have one in the book, where the two circles overlapping with the center area. So the outer limits of the middle part that overlap is the realm of possible outcomes. Well, anything really within that range is probably acceptable. More or less, your client would like it a little bit more, a little bit less, but it it's within the likely range of outcomes. And if you, like you said, if now you can be creative and find that spot in the middle where both people win, that's where lawyers can really be useful to their, I mean, really add value to their clients and find a solution that makes both people satisfied. Nobody's going to be happy, but they will be satisfied that it's an equitable result. I mean, they'll feel like that's acceptable to me. I can live with it.
Yeah, I always tell clients, listen, this is not going to be fun. People don't call me and say, "Hey, Ryan, I'm really excited to work with you."
Right.
Although, we had a podcast. I had a former client that, Jen Colson, that said, every time she hears of someone getting a divorce, she says congratulations. And there's certainly the positive divorce movement, and
Right.
you and your clients. I've certainly seen people who are much better off down the road, but
Sure.
at the end, people aren't like, that was really fun, Ryan. Like that was great. But it's looking at them, and I always tell people that, I define a win in a divorce as in 2 or 3 years, they feel like they got, a good financial settlement, that they understood what was happening, and if they have kids, that they can co-parent effectively, because I'm sure you've seen it where people, they can get every single, cent accounted for, they can get the win, the money, and that they basically just crater the other person to the point where they
Right.
won't even speak to them, and they regret it later on. And they don't realize it, but they really do regret it later on. And certainly I've seen that, and I know you have as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I talk about in the book is that taking the long view and thinking about the big picture, you're still a family. If you have children with this person, they're not going to fall off the face of the earth. You're still going to go to sports stuff at the high school and graduations and weddings with these kids, and the kids are going to be best off if you and your soon to be ex have a good relationship. And the sooner you get the divorce done in a reasonable way that's acceptable to both of you, the sooner you're going to heal and build that new relationship, whatever that the flavor of that relationship is going to be with your ex going forward. And it's important that it be a decent one. So it doesn't have to be wonderful, but it should be, at least respectful and amicable. So you're modeling for your children. They're watching. And if you're bad mouthing your spouse or they're bad mouthing you, or they're saying things like they don't want them around and things of that nature, that's really poisonous for the kids. And they're not going to do well with that stuff.
Oh, one thing to kind of cap off that point is, one thing that I have found to be effective is I always ask people, that have kids, what is the high school graduation? What does that look like to you?
That's a great question.
And is it going to be that one of you goes because you can't breathe the same air, or
Right.
is it that you could be sitting there and you might not be best friends, but you can at least look up at that child graduating from high school. And it could be, I mean, I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. It could be a very long ways off.
Yep.
And my partner, Amy, she just finished up a divorce, and her son, he just turned 3. That's a really far way off. And how you conduct yourself in this critical moment is important. So switching
Right.
gears, you mentioned in your book, you've got a story about Chris, and he's a business owner, and as listeners to this podcast will recognize, we have a story about Eric Wolf, and that his wife, they go into counseling, and she says she's hired a divorce lawyer, and you recommend people like Eric Wolf or Chris, who are business owners, that they take a business-like approach to their divorce, and
Yes.
that's hard given the emotional. So can you explain what you mean by that, and having a cost benefit analysis each and every step of the way?
Sure. So the best approach for anybody in divorce, not just business owners, but for business owners, entrepreneurs, to think about the divorce as they do other transactions, other things they do in their business, and try their best to keep emotion out of their decision-making process when deciding what to do in terms of settlement or moving forward with a certain step in litigation, for example. Talking to the attorney to understand what the true costs are of each stage of the game, and also the long game in the case versus the benefits. So first of all, assessing, we talked about the guardrails. So what is the realm of possibility from X to Y or whatever it is for the outcomes. So understanding the range, a realistic range of outcomes, not pie in the sky stuff, but what is really possible. That's number one. Number two, what is it going to cost to get there? Not just in attorney's fees, although that's important, but the other costs are cash burn rate. So, we're spending more money during the divorce because we're buying clothes, we're going out to dinner more. We maybe somebody has an apartment or they got a separate condo or home to live in and they moved apart. Kids' expenses are higher, transportation is more expensive, etc. So burn rates are usually higher for cash along the way. People have their eye off the ball with their careers, so you're losing something on the job because you're not as well able to focus on your job. You're talking to your divorce lawyer, you're emotionally dwelling on your divorce, and then the emotional impact on you and your kids can't be discounted. So there's four costs, and considering those costs versus the benefit, weighing that at every stage, make sure you're making logical decisions for each stage of the game rather than emotional ones that are going to cost you more than they're worth. So the classic example is somebody calls and they're upset about, let's just say it's a $5,000 problem. Let's make it up and say it's a $5,000 problem. And then you as a lawyer know that it's going to cost $5,000 to solve the problem. Well, some lawyers will tell their clients that and some won't. Some will say, well, it's going to cost money, but they won't say how much. Say, well, I don't know how much. Well, the client needs to know that up front. If you have any way of figuring it out, and most lawyers can because they've had previous experience, so giving them a ballpark, say, well, Chris or your client Wolf, it's going to cost us maybe $4,000 to $6,000 to solve your $5,000 problem. Do you still want to file the motion? And then they say, gee, I don't think so. That's not so important to me anymore. Well, that's good guidance. And so a well-informed client asks those questions. Okay, I want this, my id or whatever, my wants want this. What is it going to, first of all, can I achieve it? Secondly, what does it cost for me to achieve it? Sometimes it's not even achievable. If they really look at it, they can't get it. Then number two, or it'll take too long or cost too much, and then they're still not sure if it's going to work. And then the cost is too high. So assessing those things in a business-like manner is what I'm getting at in the book. And all too often, people fall in the trap of just reflexively litigating, doing the next thing in the litigation, filing the motion, taking the depositions, doing the next things, kind of like right out of the lawyer handbook, without really looking at what's my goal? What am I getting at trial? For example, do I need to take the deposition of so-and-so? Maybe not. What am I really worried about that they're going to say at trial where I need their deposition? You might not need it. That's 3 hours plus 3 hours of prep or something like that. That's a lot of money. Those are just examples. What you happen, and one other thing about business people in divorce is they think it's like every other deal sometimes. So when they're negotiating, I've had business clients say, tell them to go screw themselves. Tell them to take a hike. Well, the problem is they're not going to take a hike because you're still married to them. So in a normal business situation, you can go get another vendor. You can go get another customer. So you can tell them to take a hike and you'll find another customer. Well, you're stuck with your customer or your vendor in this deal. And if you say take a hike, then the judge is going to decide for you, and that might not be the best outcome.
Yeah, don't hire divorce lawyers to argue over pots and pans. And just go buy some new pots and pans. You'll get nicer pots and pans, and it doesn't make sense to argue over that. I was talking with some civil litigators at a party because I'm friends with lawyers. I'm sure you are.
Sure.
You're married to one, and we were talking about it. It's unfortunate that some lawyers just will not be candid about, and it's hard. It's a product of the inefficiencies and the problems with some of our society. I still
Yes.
believe it's the best, dispute resolution that is, out there. But that, you have to have, some there is a threshold to what you can go after, and it doesn't
Right.
make sense to spend $1,000 over pots and pans. It just, but people, they have an emotional attachment to that china, and there's certainly some circumstances in which it can get into that realm. I've certainly dealt with some wine collections or art collections that are 6 7 figures, that
Sure.
makes sense. But it doesn't make sense to argue over that stuff.
Well, yeah, and it also goes beyond smaller. Well, you raised it. Some of these items are big ticket items, but not just personal property, but the overall settlement. So, for example, there's profit in just being done, which is why the book is called "I Just Want This Done." One of the reasons why is almost every client at some point in the case just says, "I just want this done. Get it over with. I need to move on with my life." I don't, in Cook County in Chicago, a case can take 3 years if you go to trial. Well, people need stuff done. These things don't age like fine wines. So there's a value in just being done that sometimes has a real price tag. So for example, sometimes I'll be giving advice to a high net worth or high income individual, which is be a little bit nicer than you have to be. Give a little bit more than you maybe should. For example, maybe a little bit more maintenance, maybe a little bit longer maintenance, maybe a little bit more of the assets to get it over with, because that's worth it in and of itself. The numbers have to work out, but instead of giving the bare minimum, giving the bottom, which might make the other person want to fight for more, if you find that it's just going to take a little bit, then give a little bit and get it out of your mind and grow your business and go on to bigger and better things instead of being mired in the divorce another year. That's worth a ton for people, especially successful people. Think about what it's worth to have your mind free of this thing for an entire year. What you can accomplish getting it in the rearview mirror. It's huge.
Right. And that brings us to our fifth point in that being nice goes a very long way. So, what do you say to people, Rafe, that are, really focused on what's fair?
So a good colleague of mine, a guy named Jim Lenahan, is a divorce lawyer and a friend in the area. He's a collaborative lawyer. His line is fair is another four-letter F word. So he says, what his point is that your fair is different than my fair, and fair from childhood it has a bunch of stuff wrapped around it, which is why we always tell clients, the law says equitable, not fair in terms of division of assets in Illinois. Equitable might not be equal, and it might not seem fair because fair is a relative concept. I'll tell clients, it's not cosmically, or let's say even morally fair that you're getting divorced. Let's say the person thinks they're sort of the one that's on the downside. They didn't want the divorce, the other person wanted the divorce, and they're against the whole thing to begin with. Nothing feels fair about it at all. They feel ripped off, and understandably so. So there's no fair in it. And you could tell them all, it could be the best deal in the world. And you and I know it as lawyers, we look at it and say, that's a phenomenal deal on paper. And they still feel terrible. And they're upset with their lawyers thinking, well, you didn't get what I wanted, which ultimately might have been to not get divorced in the first place. And there's nothing we can do to stop that. Or like you mentioned in the beginning, court doesn't give you this cosmic justice that people want, the lightning bolt to hit the bad person, so to speak, or a halo for the good person. That stuff doesn't happen in court. Nobody gets sort of their just desserts. And that frustrates people.
Oh, absolutely. And I think people when they have this vision of what it's going to feel like for them just to tell the judge their story, and
Right.
if I could just tell the judge how I have been wronged, they will understand.
Right.
And that their concept of fairness would be, you know, an apology or all the money, and yet they still will not feel the way that they anticipate that they will feel, and how you guide someone through that and tell them that it's not necessarily going to feel the way that you think it will.
Right. And you won't really feel good at the end, even if you get this stuff. It's and a lot of what we do is some counseling, and we always recommend people get divorce coaches and counselors for this reason, because there's this big portion of one of the things I say is 90% of divorce is stuff lawyers can't do anything about. 90% of the stuff that bothers clients is emotional, communication related, kids things going on at work, stuff going on with their spouse, and we don't have a law, or there's no motion we can bring. There's nothing we can do in court to make them to fix that 90%. Division of assets, sure, child support, alimony, custody, visitation. That's it. We have a very limited toolbox. And having clients understand what's realistic and what's achievable in the beginning and managing expectations is important. And so in the book, I'm trying to do that and have kind of a user manual for divorce so folks are armed with information even before they go to a lawyer for a consult to know, okay, what is it? What can be achieved? What is realistic for me to expect? And not pin all their hopes on a divorce attorney to make everything in their life great. It's not realistic.
Well, we're just scratching the surface during this, and we could go on for hours and hours, Rafe. But just for listeners to have an idea, I mean, go pick up the book. There's a lot more in there. Rafe, when's it gonna drop?
It's dropping Thursday, July 15th on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Thank you.
So by the time this airs, it should be readily available. I just want this done, and just for people that to give them an idea of what all is in there. There's, Rafe, you talk about reconciliation and whether or not that is a viable solution, and whether just some things to consider. I mean, I see it all the time, but you've put it in writing. You've got divorce myths. That the judge is biased, or I want to win, the various things that divorce lawyers hear all the time. The thing I thought was, excellent was owning a business, and how you approach that, the predetermined LLC, the operating agreement that says that it's worthless, the business valuation experts, and explaining it for clients. How do you value a business? And for both the business owner as well as the other spouse, and then getting into the parenting, the do's and don'ts relating to parenting. So there's a lot to unpack there. For people that want to find out more about you, Raif, can you tell our listeners where they can find out more information about you?
Thanks, Ryan. The best place to go is right to the book's website, ijustwantthisdone.com. There are links there, explanation about the book. There's also a Medium page where I have an excerpt to the foreword and the first chapter, preface and the first chapter are published there for free so people can get a feel for the beginning of the book. Over 300 pages of content, all the stuff that I've told clients over the years that's not easily Googleable information. It's strategic, not tactical. The idea was there was a niche that wasn't filled out there for kind of a user manual to divorce in general that applies to all 50 states, really probably the US, Canada, UK, theoretically, because this stuff is kind of timeless strategic advice, not nuts and bolts things about child support and alimony. Those are state specific, and your local attorneys need to tell you those things. I wanted to fill in the gap with something about the overall world of divorce and how to navigate.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about taking care of yourself in a divorce, and
Yes.
how to deal with a narcissist. Those are universal issues that people can learn from, and just how not to be a jerk in a divorce, and that is universal. So thank you for contributing, and making divorce a little bit less painful and a little bit easier for those who are going through it, and divorce professionals who are in it and sometimes can be reminded of what's important. So, Ray, thank you again for the time, and we're going to have links to your book and website in the show notes. But thanks again for joining us on Divorce at Altitude, and until next time, I'm Ryan Calamea.
Thank you.